Have you ever walked out of a salary negotiation, a work meeting, or even just a conversation with your partner and thought to yourself, wait, how did they get me to agree to that? You went in with a clear plan, you knew your bottom line, but somewhere between the first handshake and the final nod, your brain just gave in. And now you're sitting there replaying it, wondering where exactly you lost control of the outcome. Welcome to Mind Decoded. I'm Dr. Ann.
And I'm Zach. Dr. Ann, I have to say that opening hit a little close to home. I just had a conversation with my landlord about renewing my lease, and I walked out of the room having agreed to a higher rent increase than I'd planned for. I literally prepped for it. I had numbers, I had comparable listings pulled up on my phone, and somehow, 5 minutes in, I'm nodding and saying, that sounds reasonable. What happened to my brain?
You want the honest psychological answer? Your brain was doing exactly what it evolved to do. It wasn't malfunctioning, it was running a survival program that's about 200,000 years old. And here's the part that gets me excited every time I teach this. Once you actually see that program running in real time, you can intervene, you can rewrite the script.
Okay, I'm listening. Because right now, I just feel like I have a very expensive brain glitch.
Well, let me give you the framework first, and then you're going to recognize exactly where that glitch happened. Today, we're talking about the psychology of negotiation, but not the 12 clever tricks to win any argument kind of negotiation. I mean the deep psychological architecture that every human brain brings to the table. And we're going to pull back the curtain on some of what FBI hostage negotiators discovered about how minds really change.
FBI hostage negotiators? I thought this was going to be about, asking for a raise.
And it is. But here's what's counterintuitive. The psychological principles that work when someone's life is on the line are the exact same ones that determine whether you get that raise, or whether you end up overpaying on a car, or whether you can get your team to actually agree on a deadline. Because whether you're in a bank vault or a boardroom, the thing you're really negotiating with isn't money or deadlines or hostages. You're negotiating with the other person's emotional brain, and more importantly, your own.
So you're saying my landlord, who's a perfectly nice guy, by the way, my landlord and a hostage taker are operating from the same psychological playbook.
Not consciously, but their brains are running the same software, specifically the amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, lights up in both scenarios. See, negotiation at its core is a conflict between two fundamental drives. The first is the drive to get what you want. That's the prefrontal cortex, the rational planner. But the second, much older drive is the drive to stay safe, to avoid social rejection, to not be kicked out of the tribe. And Zach, that second drive is so powerful that it will hijack the first one without you even noticing.
Wait, so when I agree to the higher rent,
Your amygdala likely perceived a social threat. Your landlord presented the new number. Maybe he was calm, maybe he was firm, and your brain, faster than conscious thought, scanned for danger, not physical danger, social danger. The danger of conflict. The danger of disappointing someone who has power over your living situation. The danger of being seen as difficult or unreasonable. And in a fraction of a second before your prefrontal cortex could even load up those comparable listings you had on your phone, your emotional brain hit the make this threat go away button, and you said yes.
that is incredibly accurate. I remember feeling this little spike of something. I'd have called it discomfort right before I caved, and I pushed it away because I thought I was being irrational.
You weren't being irrational. You were being profoundly, evolutionarily rational. The part of your brain that kept your ancestors alive in small tribal groups where conflict could mean exile, and exile meant death, was doing its job. It's just that its job description is about 40,000 years out of date for a modern lease negotiation.
Okay, so I have a prehistoric brain trying to survive a rental market that's both depressing and strangely comforting. But what do the FBI negotiators do differently? Because I assume they're not just showing up and hoping their amygdala behaves itself.
This is where it gets fascinating. For decades, hostage negotiation followed what you might call the rational bargaining model. Offer something, demand something, make logical arguments, apply pressure, and it failed. Repeatedly. Then in the 1970s and 80s, the FBI's behavioral science unit started collaborating with psychologists to build a completely new model. And the breakthrough was understanding that you can't get to rational agreement until the emotional brain feels heard.
Wait, feels heard? I thought the whole point of being a professional was to not be emotional.
Ha! And that belief that we can separate emotion from decision making is the single biggest mistake people make in negotiation. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has done decades of research on this. He studied people who had damage to the emotional centers of their brains. Their logic was intact, their IQ was unchanged, and they could not make decisions, simple ones. What to eat, which appointment to book. Because emotion is not the enemy of decision making, it's the engine of decision making. Every choice you've ever made, your brain tagged with an emotional weight before you became consciously aware of choosing.
So the whole leave your emotions at the door advice is literally neurologically impossible.
Completely. And not only impossible, counterproductive. Because when you try to suppress the other person's emotions by being purely logical, you're actually amplifying their amygdala activation. They feel unheard. They feel like you're not acknowledging what's at stake for them. And their brain doubles down on resistance.
All right, so what do the FBI people do? Because clearly they're not saying, I hear you're upset about the hostages. Let's process that.
They call it tactical empathy. And I want to unpack this term carefully because it's not what most people think empathy means. Tactical empathy is not about being nice. It's not about agreeing with the other person. It's not about feeling what they feel. It is a deliberate cognitive tool for understanding what the other person's emotional brain is experiencing, and then verbalizing that understanding in a way that de-escalates their threat response.
Wait, so it's empathy as a strategy, not as like a warm, fuzzy feeling?
Exactly. It's information gathering and influence applied simultaneously. The lead architect of this approach at the FBI, Chris Voss, who is the lead international kidnapping negotiator, has written extensively about this. He and his team would enter a negotiation with a bank robber or a kidnapper, and their first move wasn't a demand. It wasn't an offer, it was a label. They would simply say something like, "It sounds like you're frustrated with how this is going," or "It seems like you feel you don't have many options right now."
And that works on a bank robber?
It does something extraordinary to the brain. And this is where the psychology gets really precise. When a person hears an accurate description of their own emotional state, there's a measurable drop in amygdala activation. The brain essentially goes, "Ah, someone gets it. I don't have to fight to be understood." And the moment that drop happens, the prefrontal cortex, the rational problem-solving part of the brain, comes back online. You can't reason someone into that state. You have to feel them into it.
Okay, so you're saying that labeling someone's emotion actually calms their brain down enough to think clearly.
Yes, and here's the research that really made this click for me. There was a study by UCLA neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman, published in the journal Psychological Science, where they put people in fMRI scanners and showed them pictures of angry or distressed faces. When participants simply named the emotion they were seeing, just put a word to it, there was a significant reduction in activity in their own amygdala. The very act of labeling an emotion, even someone else's, dampens the brain's threat response. Lieberman called this affect labeling. And it turns out it works not just when you're looking at a picture, but when you're sitting across a table from someone who holds your raise in their hands.
So I could have said to my landlord, "What? It sounds like you're concerned about rising property costs?" Would that have actually changed the dynamic?
Let's run that tape. What if, instead of immediately countering with your market research, you had started with a single tactical empathy statement? Something like, "It sounds like managing this property has gotten a lot more expensive for you recently."
I guess. He probably would have felt like I actually understood his position. And honestly, I didn't even think about his position. I was just thinking about my rent.
And that's the psychological trap. We go into negotiations thinking about our own argument, our own numbers, our own bottom line, and we forget that the person across from us is also a human being with a threatened amygdala, who is afraid of losing something. And until that fear is acknowledged, they literally cannot hear your logic. Their brain won't let them.
So the first tactical move isn't to present your case, it's to label their emotion. That feels almost too simple.
It feels simple because we've been trained to believe negotiation is a verbal chess match of logic and counter-logic. But the science tells a completely different story. The brain responds to feeling understood, not feeling convinced. In fact, the word convinced implies a battle, and battles activate threat responses. Understanding activates safety responses. And in safety, people become more flexible.
Okay, I'm recognizing another pattern now. This isn't just about formal negotiations, is it? I'm thinking about arguments with my partner. The ones where I keep presenting perfectly logical reasons why I'm right and she just gets angrier.
Huh, you have just described millions of relationship conflicts. And yes, the exact same psychological dynamic is at play. When you argue logic at someone who feels unheard, you are feeding their amygdala's sense of threat. Every logical point you make is received as you're not listening to me, and the more you double down on being right, the more their brain doubles down on resistance. The only way out of that loop is to pause the logic and label the emotion. It sounds like you're feeling that I'm not really hearing your side of this.
Yeah, I've definitely been on both sides of that one.
And look, once you understand the mechanism behind this, you might actually feel more compassion for yourself in these moments. Because this isn't a character flaw. It's not that you're bad at negotiating or bad at relationships. It's that your brain, and everyone else's brain, is running on emotional operating systems that were built for survival, not for optimal communication. And nobody teaches us the user manual.
So, what's the user manual? What do the FBI negotiators do after they've labeled the emotion? Because I assume they don't just keep labeling forever.
Right. Once the emotional brain is de-escalated, the next tool is something Voss calls mirroring. And this one is so simple, it almost sounds like a magic trick. Mirroring is just repeating the last 1 to 3 words the person said with an upward inflection, like a question. The research behind this is rooted in what psychologists call the chameleon effect.
The chameleon effect? That sounds like a spy thing.
It's actually a deeply pro-social thing. Psychologists Tanya Chartrand and John Barge published a landmark paper on this in 1999. They found that when people subtly mimic each other's body language, speech patterns, or word choices, rapport increases significantly. And this is the key part. The person being mimicked tends to become more generous and helpful. Not because they notice the mimicry consciously, they almost never do, but because the unconscious mind registers similarity and safety.
So, if my boss says we're really constrained by the Q3 budget, I just say Q3 budget with a question mark in my voice, and that does something.
It does 2 things. First, it signals unconsciously that you are paying very close attention, that you are in sync. Second, and maybe more importantly, it almost always causes the other person to elaborate. They hear the mirror and think, oh, I should explain more about that. So you get more information. And in negotiation, information is leverage. Your boss might say, well, yeah, the Q3 budget, marketing spent most of it and left us with almost nothing for new hires. Now you know the real constraint. Before the mirror, all you had was a closed door.
That's brilliant because it doesn't feel like a tactic, it's just repeating.
Exactly. And because it doesn't feel like a tactic, it doesn't trigger the other person's defenses, which is the core problem with most negotiation advice. The tricks people try to use, the anchoring, the bluffing, the power poses, they often register at some level in the other person's brain as manipulation. And manipulated brains become less cooperative, not more. Neuroscience research on trust by Paul Zak at Claremont Graduate University has shown that when people perceive a social interaction as manipulative, their brains reduce oxytocin production. Oxytocin is the neurochemical that facilitates trust and cooperation. So the very tactics people use to win a negotiation are often chemically sabotaging the trust they need to close a deal.
So, tactical empathy and mirroring are trust building, not manipulation.
They are, but only if they're genuine. And this is the ethical core of the whole framework. You can't fake tactical empathy. You actually have to be curious about what the other person is experiencing. The label has to be a genuine attempt to understand, not a cynical script. People can tell the difference, maybe not consciously, but their amygdala can.
Okay. So we've labeled the emotion, we've mirrored to build rapport and get information. What's the next piece? Because I still eventually have to, ask for what I want.
Now we get to the most counterintuitive tool of all. And I want you to really sit with this one, Zach, because I think it's going to unlock something for you.
All right, I'm braced.
The most powerful word in a negotiation is no.
No? I thought the whole goal was to get to yes.
That's what most people think. And it's exactly backwards. Think about how you feel when someone is obviously trying to get you to say yes. A salesperson asking, "Doesn't this sound like a great deal?" A manager saying, "You're on board with this timeline, right?" Your brain immediately goes on alert. You feel cornered. You feel like you're being led. And your autonomy, which is one of the most fundamental psychological needs humans have, is under threat. So you resist even if the yes would have been fine.
Oh, that's literally how I felt at the car dealership last year. The guy kept asking me, "Doesn't that price work for you?" And every time he asked, I wanted to say no more.
Exactly. The pursuit of yes creates resistance. But no, a genuine, authentic invitation to say no creates safety. Chris Voss writes about this extensively. He often opens a negotiation with a question designed to get a no. Something like, "Would it be a terrible idea if we talked about adjusting the timeline?" Or, "Have you given up on making this project work?"
Wait, those sound like you're setting yourself up to fail. You're literally asking for a no.
And when the person says no, what happens? Their amygdala relaxes. They feel in control. They feel autonomous. And from that place of safety, they become much more willing to engage. The no doesn't mean the negotiation is over. It means it's actually beginning. Because once someone says no, they've exercised their autonomy. Now they're free to explore a yes without feeling like a pushover.
So, no is like an emotional release valve. You give them the no so they don't have to fight for it later.
That's beautifully put, and once that release valve has been used, once the other person feels safe and autonomous, you can introduce what you actually want. But here's the final piece, and this one is about protecting yourself from the exact pattern you experienced with your landlord.
The caving because my amygdala panicked pattern.
That's the one. The way you protect yourself is not by being tougher or more aggressive. It's by having a calibrated question ready. Calibrated questions are open-ended questions that start with how or what. They do two things simultaneously. They keep you from making a concession you'll regret, and they shift the burden of problem solving onto the other person.
Okay, give me an example. If my landlord says the new rent is $2,200 and my amygdala is doing its prehistoric panic thing, what's a calibrated question?
Instead of saying okay or countering with a number that's going to feel like a battle, you could say, "How am I supposed to make that work with the current market rates?" That question does something remarkable. It doesn't say no. It doesn't say yes. It invites the landlord to solve a problem with you. And it buys your prefrontal cortex time to get back online.
How am I supposed to make that work? I like that. It's honest. It's not aggressive, but it's not a surrender either.
And that's the sweet spot. Neither submission nor aggression, but collaborative problem solving. And the neuroscience supports this. When you ask a genuine how question, you're activating the other person's prefrontal cortex. You're inviting them to think rather than react. And when two prefrontal cortices are engaged together in solving a problem, you've left the battlefield entirely. You're not fighting each other, you're fighting the problem together.
So the whole framework is label the emotion to calm their amygdala, mirror to build rapport and get information, invite a no to give them autonomy, and then use calibrated how and what questions to move into actual problem solving.
You've just summarized about 2 decades of FBI behavioral research in 4 steps. And here's what I love about this framework. It doesn't require you to be a different person. You don't have to become aggressive or slick or performative. You just have to understand what brains actually need to feel safe enough to be flexible.
This honestly changes how I think about almost every difficult conversation I've had in the past year. I keep replaying moments where I either pushed too hard with logic and created more resistance, or caved too fast because I got uncomfortable. And both of those are the same root problem. I wasn't paying attention to the emotional brain in the room. Mine or theirs?
And look, once you understand the mechanism behind this, you might actually feel more compassion for yourself. Because this isn't a character flaw, it's a brain feature. Your amygdala was trying to protect you, and now you know how to thank it for its service and gently hand the microphone back to your prefrontal cortex.
Thank your amygdala and hand over the mic. I'm going to put that on a sticky note. But seriously, Dr. Ann, I think the part that's landing hardest for me is that I've spent years thinking negotiation was about being smart and prepared. And I was smart and prepared. But I was smart and prepared only about my side. I never once thought about what the other person's brain was protecting.
And that's the shift. Real negotiation mastery isn't about overpowering the other person. It's about understanding what they're afraid of losing and what they need to feel safe enough to move. When you can do that, you're not just a better negotiator. You're a better colleague, a better partner, a better friend.
Right, if you're listening to this right now and you are about to walk into a meeting or a difficult conversation, here's what I want you to try. Just one thing. Before you say anything about what you want, say something that shows you understand what they might be feeling. A simple label. It seems like this has been a frustrating process. It sounds like you're under a lot of pressure on this deadline. See what happens. See if the whole room doesn't breathe a little differently.
That's beautifully said. And if you want more psychology that actually explains your life, not just abstract theories, but the real, sometimes messy, always fascinating ways your brain shows up in your daily experience, subscribe to Mind Decoded. We release a new episode every single day. Hit the bell so you don't miss one.
And share this episode with someone you're about to negotiate with. No, seriously, share it with a friend. The more people who understand this, the less everyone has to fight unnecessary battles.
Today, we've learned that the path to yes runs directly through no, and that the most powerful thing you can bring to any conversation isn't a better argument. It's a clearer understanding of what the human brain actually needs to feel safe. That's a tool you can carry with you everywhere.
Thanks for being here. We'll decode more tomorrow.